Hi, my name is Alan Marshall, and welcome to my fieldwork assignment number 3 for philosophy of art. Um, our assignment was to basically watch a movie and find 2 to 3 professional reviews and 2 to 3 amateur reviews about the film, and compare and contrast them with our own experience watching the film. Let me just start by saying that I chose to watch the film The Witch. Since it was around the Halloween season, me and my mom decided to watch a scary movie, or a movie that we thought would be scary. Um, Let me just say my own personal experience. I thought the film was very boring and lackluster. Uh, Impressive as far as visual storytelling and authenticity as far as the times, because I read that the film was supposed to take place in the year 1630s, in the 1630s, somewhere around there. And the language is very authentic. It's very biblical language. There's lots of thy and thou and ye, things like that. But that was about it for the positives on my end. But the first reviewer that I found was Anthony Lane, and let me just start with saying he actually liked the movie. But when I was reading his review, I discovered that this was more of like describing character and its relation to other films, as and not so much reviewing the actual film. So I wrote Lane describes characters in an interesting way using basically the diction of a critic. So the way he described these characters was very language like. He was using a lot of language words that people don't typically use when describing something. And it made me think of, in today's class discussion, about the inexperienced wine taster not having many things to say about the wine, but an experienced wine taster would have a lot more to say about it. Me, I'm not a movie reviewer. I just like movies, and I have a general idea of what makes a good movie and what doesn't make a good movie. And this person just has a different taste in movies, I guess, relating to the lesson. Also, he seems to be okay with unanswered questions, like in the beginning of the movie when the witch was rubbing the baby parts on her and making herself young again. I sat there and thought, what is going on? The movie better answer my questions. I mean, it made her young, but okay, that happened in the beginning of the film with no context whatsoever. Thanks. And also how the goat, if the goat really was possessed by Satan or not, or if it was just under the influence of the witch, kind of like how the bunny was earlier in the film. That question wasn't really resolved. And Anthony's okay with that. He's like, oh, that's fine. It was still true to the times in a very visually authentic movie, which was basically his review. And in my opinion, that is not even a review. It was just talking about the movie and then relating it to other movies that he's seen. So then I moved on to my second reviewer, James Baran, James Berardinelli. James Berardinelli. He's a film critic as well who didn't like the film. And I felt like he was more focused on the movie itself than Anthony was. He says that there's uneven screenplay, which there is. A lot of scenes that you can't quite follow, and it may be because of the language, but there's also elements that they just straight up drop. Like, for instance, the son in the movie looks at his sister in a lustful way, which was an element that was dropped a quarter a quarter way through the movie, and was never acknowledged with again. Um, every modern horror trope. So yes, you got the family, an isolated area, the dark, scary woods, um, supernatural forces, the high-pitched screeching of the musical score, uh, the raising uh, moans of the chorus, the singers, and we've all heard that before, which contributes to my boredom. I've heard the loud screams, the loud strings before. It immediately reminded me of Insidious. Um, I've heard the moans before. It reminded me of all those other movies, The Conjuring, Insidious, like I named Annabelle, all those things. And those things, they bore me. I've seen them so many times, and this movie has no problem with doing that. James also wrote that it's very slow paced, and is a very low scare quotient, which means there's not many raw scares. There's not many jump scares, but there's a lot of creepy moments, like when the crow is picking at the woman's breast because she went crazy because her 2 kids died. Um, the witch killing the baby wasn't too creepy. Another creepy thing was at the end when the main character, the older girl, is talking to Lucifer about becoming a witch. That was kind of creepy because we never actually get to see him. We just see his hand on her shoulder, which was completely silhouetted, and that was creepy. But there's no like jump scares. It doesn't scare you. And then what he pointed out, the last scene was so overdone that it was laughable, and it is laughable. What happens is she, of course, with Satanism, Satan worship, it's a common trope to be naked. And so she strips naked, she walks into the woods slowly, and sees all these other people around a campfire, presumably witches, who are all naked, and they're just screaming and dancing, and it it made me laugh because it just reminded me of like these crazy hippies on LSD, and they're just having a bonfire, having a good old time out in the middle of the woods, smoking weed and going crazy. And she walks up, like, instantly sticks out, and I expected them to look at her like, oh, we have a newcomer, come join us, but no one acknowledges her. She's like, might as well not even be there. And so they're still going crazy. Then all of a sudden they start floating. They start floating in the air. I kid you not. They float in the air. What does this? I don't know. Magic, witches, whatever. The director says deal with it, so we're dealing with it. I apologize for going off on tangents. I'm just saying that this movie just did not work for me. And she's laughing and floating, and then she starts crying, and I think she's like laughing again. Then she stops, and then the movie cuts to credits. And so that was another one of those scenes. It's just like uneven screenplay. It's like, where did that even come from? Okay, so those were my 2 professional reviewers. You can see that one, or at least in my opinion, the second one that was more critical of the movie reviewed the actual movie, whereas the first one was more talking about the elements within the movie that were good, like the characters in the time period. But that's all Anthony really talked about, was the characters in the time period, and didn't even talk about the events in the movie. Barely. He did, but barely. The average moviegoers are the ones I mostly relate to. Our first one is from Margarita S. She asked the exact same question I did, which is, what am I missing? Surely there has to be some sort of element or elements that we're missing in this movie that causes people to give them high reviews. Like most of the critics gave this film a high review, a high rating. It had a 91 on Rotten Tomatoes. That's amazing. That's like the Avengers. I think the Avengers was like a 91. And this movie is worlds worse than the Avengers to me. So, we must be missing something. We gotta be. There was no creep factor. I don't really agree with that. It was creepy, I will say. But, it was creepy in a, sort of like trying too hard to be creepy. It wasn't subtle with its creepiness. It was almost as if the movie was saying, okay, now we're going to be creepy. Look at the woods. And there's scenes in the movie where you just look at the woods for like 5 seconds, which is way too long for a transition scene. And you're just sitting there staring at the woods. And at one moment I remember saying out loud while I'm watching the movie, looking at the woods, I'm like, okay, we get it, we're in the woods. Keep the screenplay going. It doesn't keep the screenplay going because it's too slow paced, which causes it to be boring. And another question she had was WTF. There's a lot of WTF moments, and they're not the good WTFs like, oh man, WTF is happening. It's more like, what is happening in this movie? There was a scene in the movie where there's 4 lines of dialogue happening at the same time. The 2 little kids are screaming in the background while 2 other characters are trying to have a conversation. And I'm like, what is going on in this scene? Because I'm missing everything. And the language is not easy to follow because they use the old biblical language. I was just like, what is going on? Especially at the end, I was like, they're floating. What the F is going on? So that was one average moviegoer review. Another one was Devin E. He says this is more like a thriller movie than a horror movie, which I agree. It's not very scary, but it's got sort of a creep factor to it. And just to go on with that, he says it's not on par with other horror movies, which is true. I've seen other horror movies, and I generally don't get scared with horror movies anyway, but I can tell when one is good, and this one wasn't. A main word between me and the average moviegoers was boring. Overall, this movie was just boring. And if I had to describe the movie in one word, that's the word I would use. So, those are my 4 reviewers. As you can see, very different kinds of tastes. I felt like the average reviewers were much more down to earth and easier to relate to. And the professional critics, they had a sort of language. You could tell that they were trained to look at certain elements within a film and be able to critique them. So, was there any kind of strong consensus, I assume, between what the reviewers were saying? Not really. The ones who didn't like it were saying that it's very boring, and the ones that did like it say that it was very authentic and true to character development and the biblical references and the supernatural, things like that. I'm part of the retrospective background knowledge, technical knowledge. Okay, that's pertaining to the professional critics, which, yeah, I'm pretty sure they did go to film school and they do know what makes a good film and what doesn't make a good film. It's just that people have different tastes on what makes a good film or not. I love Quentin Tarantino. I think he's a very good writer, director, and his movies are fantastic. Pulp Fiction, Reservoir Dogs, Django. But some people don't like him because he's different. He is different, and his movies are a bit graphic and gritty. And a lot of people, well, some people don't like that. So that's just that difference in taste, I like a little bit of graphic and gritty in my movies, whereas someone like my mom doesn't really like the graphic gritty stuff. We have different tastes in movies. Uh, which one is right? Sorry, I paused for a second. I thought I heard someone moving around upstairs. We have different tastes. One of us likes the gritty, one of us doesn't. But who is right? Well, according to Hume, from what I got in the reading, there's no really right and wrong to taste. The beautiful remains in the mind. It is, how you say, in the eye of the beholder. It is not objective. So we can't be wrong on tastes. We can have different tastes, but we can't be wrong about our tastes. So here are some final follow-up questions, and I'll end the video because I know it's getting long. Does a good movie critic possess any special expertise or specifically cultivated tastes that you can put label or labels to? Yes, definitely. I can tell that they both have a background in film, and they know what they're talking about when critiquing certain elements or talking about certain elements of the film. Very detailed, structured, easy to follow elements in the film, whereas the average moviegoers, they were saying things like, "Oh, this is the most boring film ever," but they wouldn't really tell us why the film was boring. The film was boring to me because it didn't have a consistent screenplay and there was no scares. I guess I had too high of expectations for the film, and that's why the movie was boring for me. The language was hard to follow, so I wasn't really interested in the dialogue because I couldn't understand I understood most of it, but I couldn't understand 100% of the dialogue. And I prefer character development. There wasn't really much character development. We just have a gritty dad, an old mom, and some kids. It's pretty much as far as it goes. I barely remember their names, which is awful in a film. You want your characters to be known. You want them to be remembered because you want the audience to care. But if there's no character development, I don't care what happens to the characters. And if I don't care what happens to the characters, I lose interest. Therefore, your film is boring to me. And that's what this film lacked. And a lot of the average moviegoers didn't understand how to articulate that, whereas the experts knew how to articulate that. I think that pretty much covers everything. So thank you so much for sitting through this longer than average video, but I knew there was too much to talk about to fit into a shorter than 8-minute video. So thank you again. My name is Alan Marshall, and I will see you next time.